You are eating salads for lunch. You are doing 45 minutes on the treadmill 4 times a week. You are tracking your calories, staying under your limit, doing everything your doctor told you to do. And your belly is still growing. Not a little, noticeably. The kind of growth you feel when you put on last year's jeans and the button simply refuses. You are not imagining it. You are not being lazy. Your body has changed at a cellular level that no amount of lettuce and light jogging can touch, and the weight loss industry knows it. They have always known it. And right now, millions of adults over 50 are discovering what they believe is the final solution to this problem. Injectable synthetic drugs that suppress your appetite so severely you forget what hunger even feels like. Ozempic, Wegovy, semaglutide. The names are everywhere. Celebrities are shrinking on television. Waiting lists are months long, and the pharmaceutical companies are reporting profits that would make any corporation weep with envy. But here is what they are not telling you in those glossy advertisements, and what your prescribing physician may not even fully understand yet. Up to 40% of the weight lost on these GLP-1 receptor agonist drugs is not fat. It is lean muscle mass. It is the structural tissue that holds your skeleton upright, that keeps you out of a wheelchair at 70, that determines how fast your metabolism runs every single hour of every single day for the rest of your life. When you lose muscle after 50, you do not get it back easily. Your basal metabolic rate collapses, your insulin sensitivity craters further, and the moment you stop the injection, which most people eventually must because of cost, side effects, or supply issues, you rebound with a fat mass that is now sitting on top of a body with significantly less metabolic machinery to burn it. You end up heavier, weaker, and more metabolically broken than before you started. I am going to show you exactly why your body got stuck in this fat storage prison in the first place, and I am going to show you a precise, clinically validated molecular strategy that activates the same biological pathway these drugs attempt to hijack, but does it naturally, protects every gram of your muscle, and does not require a prescription, a weekly injection, or a second mortgage on your home. The reason everything you have tried has failed is not your willpower. It is not your discipline. It is a phenomenon that begins quietly in your early 40s and accelerates dramatically after 50, a process called cellular insulin resistance. And once you understand what is happening inside your body at the molecular level, the frustration you have been carrying for years is going to transform into a very specific, very actionable clarity. Picture every muscle cell in your body as a room. That room has a lock on the door. Insulin is the key. When you eat carbohydrates, your blood sugar rises, your pancreas releases insulin, insulin travels to the muscle cell, inserts itself into the receptor, turns the lock, and the door opens. Glucose floods into the muscle. It gets stored as glycogen. It gets burned for energy. The whole system is elegant and efficient. At 30 years old, that lock opens smoothly, every time, on the first try. But here is what happens after 50. Chronic low-grade inflammation, driven by years of accumulated visceral fat, processed food residue, hormonal decline, and the gradual deterioration of mitochondrial function, begins to coat that cellular lock with a kind of molecular rust. Researchers call the specific mechanism impaired IRS, 1-phosphorylation, which means the insulin receptor substrate, the protein that allows the key to actually turn, becomes chemically blocked. The key arrives, the key inserts, but the lock does not open. Insulin knocks and knocks. Your pancreas, interpreting the silence as insufficient insulin output, pumps out even more. Blood glucose levels remain dangerously elevated, and your body, facing this crisis of toxic circulating sugar, initiates an emergency protocol. It takes that blood glucose and shunts it directly into fat cells. Not subcutaneous fat, the soft layer under the skin that is inconvenient but relatively harmless. Visceral fat. The deep, metabolically active fat that wraps itself around your liver, your pancreas, your intestines, your heart. The fat that secretes inflammatory cytokines, disrupts hormonal signaling, and creates a feedback loop that makes the lock on your muscle cells even more rusted, even more resistant, perpetuating the entire disaster. This is not a theory. This mechanism is documented in peer-reviewed literature going back decades. A landmark series of studies published in the journal Diabetes Care confirmed that skeletal muscle insulin resistance is the primary defect driving obesity in middle-aged adults, preceding and causing the fat accumulation, not the other way around. Your fat is not the problem. The rusted lock on your muscle cells is the problem. And until you fix that lock, no calorie deficit on Earth will produce lasting results, because your body will simply protect its fat stores and cannibalize muscle instead. Here is the mechanism behind that AMPK pathway I mentioned, because understanding it is the key to everything. AMPK stands for AMP-activated protein kinase. It is an enzyme, a master cellular sensor, that functions like a thermostat inside every cell of your body. When energy supplies are low and your cells need fuel, AMPK activates. When it activates, it initiates a cascade of fat-burning signals. It tells fat cells to release their stored triglycerides. It tells mitochondria to multiply and become more efficient. It suppresses the production of new fat tissue. It improves the sensitivity of that rusted insulin receptor lock. And critically, when properly stimulated, it does all of this without destroying the mTOR signaling pathway, which is the separate molecular mechanism responsible for muscle protein synthesis and preservation. The problem is that after 50, the AMPK pathway becomes progressively desensitized. The thermostat breaks. Your cells stop registering the burn fat now signal with anywhere near the sensitivity they had at 30. Your body defaults to its most primitive survival behavior, storing energy as fat and conserving every calorie it can against a perceived famine that never comes. This is not a lifestyle problem. This is cellular biology. And the mainstream health industry has built an enormously profitable ecosystem around pretending that eating less and moving more is sufficient to overcome it. Now, let me show you exactly how badly the current trendy solution fails this specific biological reality. Semaglutide and its pharmaceutical relatives work by mimicking a hormone called GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide 1, which slows gastric emptying, reduces appetite, and modestly improves insulin signaling. In a vacuum, this sounds reasonable, but the clinical picture when applied to adults over 50 is alarming. A 2023 study published in JAMA Internal Medicine analyzing body composition changes in patients on semaglutide found that of the total weight lost, approximately 38 to 42% was lean mass, meaning muscle, bone density, and connective tissue. For a person who loses 20 pounds on these drugs, that means roughly 8 to 9 pounds of that loss is structural muscle. In a 40-year-old with a robust training history and high anabolic hormone levels, this is manageable. In a 60-year-old woman with already declining estrogen, declining testosterone, and declining growth hormone, losing 8 pounds of muscle is catastrophic. It takes basal metabolic rate, the number of calories you burn at absolute rest, and it drops it by an estimated 150 to 200 calories per day permanently unless that muscle is rebuilt through intensive resistance training. For most people in this demographic, that rebuild never happens fully. Furthermore, GLP-1 drugs do absolutely nothing to repair the rusted lock. They do not restore IRS-1 phosphorylation. They do not reactivate the AMPK pathway at the cellular level. They suppress your desire to eat, which creates a temporary calorie deficit, which produces weight loss, which includes muscle destruction. The moment the drug is stopped, appetite returns with vengeance, the AMPK pathway remains broken, the insulin resistance remains intact, and the body rebuilds fat stores with terrifying efficiency onto a metabolic chassis that is now weaker and slower than before. This is not an edge case. Rebound weight gain following GLP. One drug cessation was documented in a New England Journal of Medicine follow-up study showing that within 12 months of stopping semaglutide, patients had regained an average of 2/3 of the weight they had lost, and their cardiometabolic risk markers had returned to pre-treatment levels. The industry calls this a chronic disease requiring lifetime drug use. I call it a business model. So, what does actually work at the molecular level for adults over 50? Dihydroberberine. And I want you to pay close attention here, because most people in the health space have heard of berberine, the plant-derived alkaloid extracted from herbs like Berberis aristata that has been shown to activate the AMPK pathway. And if you have tried standard berberine and felt modest results, There is a precise biochemical reason for that disappointment, and it has nothing to do with the compound itself. It has to do with absorption. Standard berberine has notoriously poor bioavailability. Its molecular structure makes it difficult for intestinal epithelial cells to absorb. Studies measuring plasma concentrations after oral berberine ingestion consistently find that the majority of the compound never crosses the intestinal wall at all. It is neutralized in the gut, excreted, and wasted before it ever reaches the cellular machinery it is supposed to activate. Dihydroberberine, abbreviated DHB, is the active hydrogenated metabolite of berberine. This is not marketing language. It is a specific chemical transformation, the addition of hydrogen atoms to the berberine molecule that fundamentally changes how it interacts with intestinal transport proteins. Research published in the journal Phytomedicine demonstrated that DHB achieves plasma concentrations approximately 5 times higher than an equivalent dose of standard berberine, with a significantly faster time to peak absorption. Once inside the cell, DHB activates AMPK through the same mechanism as standard berberine by inhibiting mitochondrial complex I and increasing the cellular ratio of AMP to ATP, which directly triggers AMPK's fat-burning cascade. But because DHB reaches the cell at meaningful concentrations instead of trace levels, the downstream effect is dramatically more pronounced. Here is what that AMPK activation specifically accomplishes inside your biology. First, it increases the translocation of GLUT4 receptors, the glucose transporter proteins, to the surface of muscle cells. This is the direct molecular solution to the rusted lock problem. It forces those doors open independently of insulin, allowing glucose to be pulled into muscle tissue even in the presence of insulin resistance. Second, it activates SIRT1, a longevity-associated enzyme that improves mitochondrial biogenesis, meaning it triggers the creation of new, more efficient mitochondria inside your cells, increasing the capacity to burn fat as fuel at rest. Third, it suppresses SREBP1C, the transcription factor responsible for signaling fat cells to produce and store new fat deposits around the organs. It does not just stop fat storage, it dismantles the molecular instruction to store fat in the first place. Critically, and this is what separates DHB from semaglutide at a mechanistic level, AMPK activation by DHB does not significantly suppress the mTOR pathway in skeletal muscle when used at therapeutic doses. mTOR, the mechanistic target of rapamycin, is the anabolic signaling hub that drives muscle protein synthesis. Maintaining mTOR activity while activating AMPK is the molecular definition of body recomposition, burning fat while preserving and building muscle simultaneously. This dual action is physiologically very difficult to achieve, and it is exactly what DHB facilitates in the aging body. Now, DHB works even more powerfully when paired with its synergistic cofactor, chromium picolinate. Chromium is a trace mineral that directly potentiates insulin receptor sensitivity. Its mechanism involves binding to a chromium-dependent oligopeptide called chromodulin, which activates the tyrosine kinase activity of the insulin receptor. In practical terms, it begins to clear the molecular rust from that cellular lock, helping insulin receptor substrate proteins restore their signaling capacity. The picolinate form is specifically chosen because picolinic acid dramatically improves chromium's absorption across the intestinal wall and its delivery to target tissues compared to other chromium chelates. A meta-analysis published in the Journal of Trace Elements in Medicine and Biology, examining 13 randomized controlled trials, found that chromium picolinate supplementation produced statistically significant reductions in fasting, blood glucose, fasting insulin levels, and HbA1c in insulin-resistant adults, with the most pronounced effects in those over 50, where the baseline insulin resistance was most severe. Together, DHB and chromium picolinate address both the AMPK desensitization and the insulin receptor impairment simultaneously. DHB fires up the metabolic engine and forces glucose uptake through the GLUT4 pathway. Chromium picolinate begins repairing the primary insulin signaling cascade. The result is a two-pronged metabolic restoration that no single pharmaceutical approach has replicated without concurrent muscle destruction. Here is the exact protocol. Precision matters here. The timing and dosage are not arbitrary. You will take 100 milligrams of dihydroberberine paired with 500 micrograms of chromium picolinate, taken together exactly 15 to 20 minutes before your largest, most carbohydrate-heavy meal of the day. This timing window is critical. DHB requires approximately 15 minutes to be absorbed and begin reaching peak plasma concentration. You want the AMPK activation and the GLUT4 translocation to be occurring at precisely the moment your blood glucose begins rising from the meal, so the machinery is primed and open to capture that glucose before insulin even needs to respond. Do not take it 30 minutes before, do not take it with the meal, 15 to 20 minutes prior, strictly. Immediately after finishing that meal, within 5 minutes, you will go for a brisk 10-minute walk, not a leisurely stroll. A purposeful, slightly breathless walk that activates your lower body musculature. This is not optional padding on the protocol. It is a mechanically essential step. Muscle contraction independently triggers additional GLUT4 receptor translocation to the cell surface through a pathway called contraction-stimulated glucose uptake, which is entirely separate from the insulin pathway and the AMPK pathway. You are layering 3 simultaneous mechanisms: the DHB-driven AMPK activation, the chromium-improved insulin signaling, and the mechanical contraction-stimulated GLUT4 translocation. All 3 working at once during the precise window of peak post-meal blood glucose elevation creates a glucose disposal effect that systematically starves your visceral fat deposits of the substrate they need to grow. Source your dihydroberberine specifically as the dihydrometabolite form, not a berberine product that claims to convert to DHB in the body. That conversion is inefficient and variable. You want the preformed, stabilized DHB capsule. Look for products that list dihydroberberine explicitly and specify the hydrogenated alkaloid fraction. Do not substitute standard berberine and expect equivalent results. The 5-fold bioavailability difference is not a minor variation. It is the difference between therapeutic cellular concentrations and trace exposure. For the 14-day metabolic rewiring challenge, here is exactly what you do. Tonight, before bed, measure your waist circumference directly at the navel with a fabric measuring tape. Not below the navel, not at the hip. At the navel, standing relaxed, not sucking in. Write that number down. This is your day 1 baseline. Beginning tomorrow, execute the protocol precisely as described every single day for 14 days. DHB and chromium picolinate 15 to 20 minutes before your largest carbohydrate meal. 10-minute brisk walk immediately after. Nothing else is required. No calorie restriction, no additional supplements, no dramatic dietary overhaul. Just this precise intervention applied consistently to the biology we have discussed. On day 14, remeasure at the navel under the same conditions, same time of day, same relaxed posture. The reduction you will observe is not water weight cycling. It is the measurable deflation of visceral adipose tissue as the inflammatory cytokine load decreases, as circulating triglycerides are redirected into muscle oxidation instead of fat storage, and as the cellular environment around your abdominal organs becomes less inflamed and less distended. Clinical trials using AMPK activators in this dosage range have documented measurable waist circumference reductions of 1 to 2 centimeters within 14 days in insulin-resistant adults, alongside preserved or improved lean mass markers. You are not being promised a transformation. You are being given the tool to observe a real, measurable biological shift in your own body with your own measuring tape in 2 weeks. If you have a family member over 50 who is currently being steered towards synthetic weight loss injections without being told about the muscle loss risk, share this video with them before they commit to a protocol that may reduce their weight in the short term while dismantling the metabolic infrastructure they need for the next 30 years of their life. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because what is coming next will completely change how you understand the relationship between your gut microbiome and the visceral fat deposits that no amount of exercise is reaching. Specifically, I am going to expose a strain of bacteria living inside the intestines of lean, metabolically healthy adults over 60 that is virtually absent in those carrying visceral fat, what it produces, why mainstream gastroenterology has buried this research, and exactly how to reintroduce it to your gut in 72 hours using a food source you can buy at any grocery store. That video will go live shortly. Do not